Everybody back for day 3 of the Environmental Protection Agency's Science Advisory Board CASTNet review meeting. Today we're going to adjust the agenda just a little bit, but before we do that, I would like to make an announcement that there's going to be an Uber to the Reagan National Airport that has a couple extra seats that a number of people here arranged. So if you wanted to join them, just see. Yes. Yeah. So I think we got 2 who would like to join. So yeah, they'll, I believe, be leaving right after the meeting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Get a van. That'll work. All right. So today's schedule, we're going to adjust a little bit. So we're going to start off with Dr. Shaw and the small group that worked last night with the table, and we'll be able to display that. And then we'll move into question 6 with Dr. Honoro after that, and then we'll do all the summaries. Okay. So before we do that, I need to welcome all of our attendees online and thank them very much. Everybody who tuned into the YouTube live stream. If you don't mind, please email me with your information as to your attendance, and I'll add you to the list of attendees in the public record. My email address is my last name dot my first name, so it's BLOOMER.Bryan, BRYAN @epa.gov. Also, if you have any comments or questions that you would like to have considered by the panel or as follow-up, you can email those to me and we'll handle those in an appropriate way. Speaking about public comments, all of the public comments received to date have been posted to the meeting website. All of the letters received prior to the meeting that were posted, except for the copyright material that may have been included as an attachment, were posted to that website. And those letters are incorporated by reference, and I'll include those in the meeting minutes. So any questions or comments before we get started? Okay, nothing heard. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Uzo and we'll get started.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Now I hear it. Yes, let me join Dr. Bloomer to thank all of you for your fine work. And what you did, you get yourself another job. I'm going to invite you to North Carolina A&T to come and present what you do. So we're very, very grateful. It's going very well. And it shows that the mind can work. It's working very, very well. And then, as Dr. Boomer said, Dr. Honoro will lead charge question 6. But before then, Dr. Stephanie Shaw, she brought up work for herself yesterday. So we want to hear from her. She's going to create a table of summaries of what we're supposed to expect, and then she will share that. Then after that, we'll go over to Dr. Honoro. Then as we go on, we have the key points responding to charge questions by lead writers. So your names are on the agenda. So Dr. Shah.
Brian, do you have
We're working on it right now.
All right, well, while they're pulling up the slide, I'll just give a bit of context to remind everybody. We talked about a lot of the individual considerations around particular measurements, parameters, sites yesterday, but we didn't really get to the point of providing guidance on if in the unfortunate event we do have to reduce network sites, what are some ways to consider doing that? So several of us got together. This is actually not just me, Katie Pradle, Sarah Nelson, John Graham, Dirk Felton, several folks provided input into this, what I would call very early mock-up of a table that we could use to try to collate the various, what we are calling objectives, as well as the strategic plan goals of the network, both current and future, and examples of types of metrics or things we could investigate or tabulate to help decide the utility of a given site in the network to all these various objectives. So that's what we we tried to create. I think it could be a useful tool, but I do want to emphasize it's a very early mock-up. Only a few of us provided input, so it's a starting point, and almost everything on here certainly can be modified. Okay, so we're actually seeing the table up on the screen now. So the way we did this was to try to take the ways that people use the network, right? The ways that the data is actually incorporated into analyses and kind of convert those into what we were calling objectives. So these are things like detect and quantify long-term trends. Well, why are we doing that? We're not doing it just to measure trends. We're doing it to fulfill the strategic plan goals. And so here is where we selected what we thought were kind of the first blush at the most important goals that objective or that activity fulfilled. So for detecting long-term trends, that's absolutely necessary to, quote, tackle the climate crisis. And these strategic plan goals are in the report, but they're also kind of taken from this image if you'd like a quick look at them. So to tackle climate, you must have quantification of long-term trends. You also need those to enforce the law, enforce environmental laws and ensure compliance, because that's the accountability piece of the regulatory action. And you need them to ensure clean air. So we kind of went through trying to assign each of these major objectives to plan goals, and then started brainstorming on possible metrics. So if you're going to have a long-term trends network, you want a mix of sites that don't have trends and a mix of sites that do have trends. And that includes those where you currently see statistically significant trends up or down, or that you expect to start to detect those because of some action, whether that be regulatory, voluntary, what have you. So I'm just going to read across the top with the objectives. We have detect and quantify long-term trends. We have detect and quantify climate-air interactions. So that's climate effects on air quality and vice versa. We have serve as a measurement platform for both air and ecology metrics. We have improved sample quality and frequency in disadvantaged communities and tribal lands, high quality ambient air measurements, coverage of geographic patterns, evaluation and improvement of models and data products, and characterization of atmospheric background air quality. So I'm going to ask anybody else that helped pull this material together what they'd like to share about this process.
I think one of the the ways that we looked at it, which was helpful, that Dr. Shaw kind of brought to everybody, and the way that I was thinking about this is, like, for example, co-located with other trends networks. So if there was a site that was kind of a standalone site, I feel like that would be a little bit lower on the priority list than other sites. So that's kind of just an example of how this could be used by EPA, because we recognize, while we don't want to shut anything down or recommend that, we recognize the changing budgets and the limitations that are associated with that. And we didn't want to leave EPA with no solutions. Like, that was one of the things that this whole group came together on. So I think this does a really good job, I hope, for EPA to kind of make decisions based on the number of sites and potential cost savings. I think that we incorporated everybody's input, but I wonder if there is a further refinement where we could even prioritize the objectives or work together to do that. So what is a higher versus lower priority for this network?
Yeah, I think it was really well summarized already, but part of the, I think a question that I had all along was how to incorporate some of the strategic plan goals, and kind of through this process realized potentially that those may be less direct objectives of CASTNet, but more, and I think that's why we added the why line. That's sort of thinking about the audiences and what are the sort of key outcomes of these objectives. So I think that was maybe an important piece to pull out separately, to think about those as the why and not as objectives of CASTNet directly. And then we could look across these and see where there are multiple aspects being served by particular set of metrics to start potentially prioritizing.
I'm not sure, maybe I missed it, but there's proximity to an axe. So especially for ozone, but potentially PM as well.
I think so the rubber meets the road on the metrics, and this is the part that's least well developed at this point. So I would say, I think we could interpret that multiple ways. Proximity to an axe site could be a benefit for certain
I
objectives.
actually mean to the level of an axe. So if you have an ozone site that is measuring a deep design value now, the new ozone standard comes out and it's very, very close to that or above it even, then that site should really be prioritized.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a great thing. But just to finish my thought, I think some of these metrics could be interpreted as pro or con adjusting a given site, depending on the objective. And we certainly haven't gotten to that point yet.
And you mentioned frequency. I think we could consider having different frequencies at different priority sites. So you could have a site alternate weeks. If it's a lower priority site, you maintain the infrastructure and everything, but you have less lab costs. That's about the only savings.
I just want to make a comment. In the NADP, we sample weekly. We have a bucket. And if you have intense rainstorm, bucket is full. So if you make it bi-weekly, then you'll be losing information. So that frequency, it may not apply to CASTNet, but I just want to make that point. Depends on the.
You still could pick up the bucket weekly, but just skip every other sample.
And still now when we have snow, start to get it. So, but it's good to put those things in mind.
Yeah, and I think that particular note under objective 1, it doesn't say what the frequency should be, but what we tried to capture was that if frequency was suggested to be changed, that some investigation might need to be done to justify that. So we put on here, maybe it's a data analysis of the error bars on longer term averages based on the sample data. Does that change substantially if you have the frequency? But there could be other considerations, just like what Dr. Uzo was saying, that may require certain metrics on certain frequency. So I guess we are happy to put this together to try to help organize our thinking. If people think this could be valuable, I'd love to, take another detailed stab at it and make sure that everybody weighs into something like this. Many of the discussions that we talked about the past few days don't fit neatly into a table like this. And that doesn't mean they're not important. We're just trying to find a way to provide guidance on if 15 CASTNet sites are dropped, which 15 those, how would we think about which 15 those would be? So, so if this is to move forward, please everyone provide your input.
I guess I would add CSN to the co-located trends networks, although it's struggled with trends. And it has a history of changing the frequency, whether it's a trend site or whether it's a state-sponsored site, the frequency is variable. Many states opt to pay for 1 and 6 rather than 1 and 3, because you still get enough information, but at half the cost.
And I guess I'll also say that it might be helpful to, if we do go forward with this as a group, think about in terms of the metrics, the things that would sort of be a deal breaker for a given objective. Like for number 2, we talked about detecting climate air interactions. And there's a piece in there for metrics that says a commitment to maintain sort of a decades scale network support. And thinking about, well, if you're trying to detect something related to climate, then a design wouldn't be to have a rotating set of sites, for example. Not that we've discussed that, but kind of think about what would potentially make that objective unattainable, and the flip side of that as a potential metric or consideration.
So just maybe thinking a little bit about our task, Dr. Uzo, when we have to kind of compile the full report, are you envisioning this maybe as something to put in the introductory material, and then the other chapter writers can reference it and show how what they're discussing fits within this larger framework, perhaps?
Yes, it's a very nice summary. It kind of brings things together at a glance.
Yeah,
Sometimes Tom Brennan, government doesn't know how much time you have to read big things, but so a chapter like this sure gets to the point.
Yeah, I mean, I just, not to comment on the content, but I think this is a terrific effort. I thank you, Stephanie, and everyone who worked on it. I think that it pulls together all the thoughts that we've heard this week into something that's really, visually understandable. And I think like these two are suggesting that this should probably be part of the document and something we can reference to. I think it's terrific.
Yeah, and maybe as we're starting to head in a little bit later today into the summary of each question, the lead writers and the teams can start to think a little bit about how what you're saying, maybe relates to this framework and fleshes out some of those details, in terms of like the stuff we were talking about with Wei Ting yesterday about specific measurements and prioritizing this measurement versus that measurement. That may even change depending on which column you're working in. So that's a thought to have here. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was exactly our point when we were putting this together, is this would be like a key feature of the introduction that everyone would be able to pull from, and it would be the overarching, decision-making grid to really help us prioritize with both within this group. And then, once we further flesh out all the details in each of the sections, then that would also, not only be a way for sort of like a policymaker to get a quick summary without having to read like, 50 pages of text or whatever. They could just look at this and hopefully get all the key nuggets of what we talked about and considered important, and could go from there. So I think that was sort of part of our.
It's almost
concept.
like a map to the future report that you're going to write. It's terrific.
And I was reminded when you were speaking that each objective requires different metrics, different pollutants, different frequency, right? And so one of the things that may result from this, which may be difficult to move forward, is that the prioritized sites for each of these columns are likely different as well. And so you could look for commonalities. Sites that meet many objectives obviously would be the most key. But that doesn't mean that sites that only meet one objective are not necessarily important if that's a key site for that objective. So, it does add some complexity, but at least then you can kind of look at all the different factors at once.
And also, this may not be the end of it. There could be more things that can be added. Yes.
So any other thoughts or questions? Because I think it's a really great orientation and it'll take a little while to digest, and we'll definitely return back to this when we go through the summaries.
Would you want to include some kind of consideration? Maybe I was trying to read through everything, so if I missed something, correct me. Something related to an environmental justice community of concern, or something like that, that be some type of priority or given consideration, maybe?
So like if there is a specific community with a specific.
Say like a tribe that was of low socioeconomic status and, maybe for those kinds of reasons, it's a higher priority site for socioeconomic reasons, I guess.
Yeah, we can put that in there. Right now.
I don't know where that would belong
So
exactly.
column 4 includes disadvantaged communities and tribal land.
Okay,
And so it
yeah.
could be a metric within there, like a unique characteristic or concern. We put metrics of community concern, so that's a little different. That's
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
that may be a specific, right, geographical characteristic that drives a particular exposure concern. But what you're talking about is more not the metric, but the community that's included. So we want to reflect a variety of demographics, but also maybe sort of like the equivalent of a sensitive population fraction.
Yeah.
What you're thinking.
Yeah,
And also, since we're taking this huge leap and innovative way to look at the metrics, maybe adding there the climate and economic justice tool, because it actually helps, it makes determining the metrics for the underserved communities, because it tells you exactly what to look for, location to polluting facilities, and then it can poverty level, health, and other things. So it actually gives the parameters for that. So maybe including that as a way to determine or rank those disadvantaged and tribal communities.
I think that those kinds of tools are really useful for providing the value of these metrics. I
Yeah.
think I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in this table, we don't necessarily prescribe how that's done, and that could be something that could be in the written section later. Just because I think here it's what are the characteristics of the site that you need to consider if you're going to try to remove it or replace it or change the metrics that are measured there. So I think the tool answers these pieces, but I think the table is more to say, what are these pieces? So I think that would be really important to include in the text around the individual sections.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to remember, you guys don't have to definitively answer it completely. What you're doing is you're making a recommendation and a suggestion of an approach. And you're giving enough example, enough specificity to sort of meet the short-term needs, but you've also laid out, I think, a method that the agency then can develop and grow into the future and maybe bring back to a future panel for evaluation relative to this starting point.
Is that it, Dr. Shaw? Dr. Shaw, is that it? Are you finished?
Yes, all done.
Okay, then we turn to Dr. Noro.
Good morning again. So I am the lead for charge question number 6. And the team members are Dr. Lone, Fight, Fisher, Vaughn, I think it's Ang, Dr. Shaw, and Nelson. So I'll start with an opening statement and I'll open it up to the team members to contribute. And as we did yesterday, any person is also free to, all members here are free to contribute to the charge question. All right. All right, thank you. So I begin by revisiting the goal, the mission of CASTNet, which is to help characterize air quality and atmospheric deposition impacts to rural and disadvantaged communities using existing data. The question here is to please advise on new data analysis that CASTNet could undertake to improve EPA ability to characterize air quality and atmospheric deposition impacts to rural and disadvantaged communities using existing data and resources. And based on the background information on CASTNet, it's been doing long-term monitoring that provides data to characterize ambient air pollution concentration in disadvantaged rural communities. And this helps to estimate air pollution deposition and quantify its ecological effects and assess the efficacy of agency air pollution control programs. So based on this, CASTNet has already been addressing some of the issues concerning charge question 6. But here are some of the recommendations that, in my opinion, should be considered. And I'll read my comments. The current monitoring and data collection tools for characterization of, can you hear me? Okay. So the current monitoring and data collection tools for characterization of air quality and atmospheric deposition will need to be revamped / enhanced for local community access and interpretation. To accomplish this, there has to be a comprehensive education and outreach initiative that will be implemented to enable these rural and disadvantaged communities to better understand the relevance of the air quality and atmospheric deposition data impacts on their health and daily activities, and to make informed decisions. Establishment of a community-based air monitoring program with portable monitoring and measurement equipment would provide real-time data, easily interpretable data analysis using CASTNet site data for quality control and evaluation. And this will be very valuable for air quality characterization and management in these disadvantaged communities. Also, additionally, EPA should prioritize monitoring and measurement of PFAS in atmospheric deposition, as well as in bodies of water and soil in the disadvantaged communities, where exposure is likely to be disproportionately higher due to proximity to pollution sources and has adverse effects. Lastly, adoption and incorporation of the climate economic justice screening tool that uses data sets that are indicators of burden in 8 categories. And those categories include climate change, burden, energy burden, health, housing, legacy pollution, transportation, water and wastewater, and workforce development. These will be relevant in addressing and monitoring data collection gaps in these disadvantaged communities. As EPA is focusing attention to environmental justice issues in all matters related to air quality monitoring and evaluation, I believe that it's important to incorporate these recommendations and data analysis in future programming and monitoring. Thank you. And I would open that to Dr. Barnes.
I just, as you were talking, I think I realized I maybe didn't look at the end of the sentence carefully enough. As I look at it now, it's saying using existing data and resources. So is that meant to be no new data types? Is that how we interpret that? Because, you know, it's like, what could you do to provide information using the existing data? Is that how that was intended? So I know I interpreted, oh, there's some things new things we should be measuring, but that maybe doesn't exactly address the way that's fully worded. I know, does anybody have a thought on that?
I took it at its word and
Yeah,
suggested that a metadata and context could be added for each site on the website. So if you clicked on a site, it would say what's co-located there, a slams. Is there mercury fish data there if it's a rural lake area? So what other studies are using data from that site? So it's the kind of thing that if it was updated annually, somebody looking at the data would say, hey, what else is available at that site, or who's using that data now?
Mhm.
Maybe I want to get involved in that study. So it's expanding the use of the information that's existing rather than adding directly to it.
Yeah. One thought I had, and Melissa can probably answer this question. Do you issue individual site reports? You know, like NADP has been experimenting with? Because that can be really useful. And I know in the Mercury network, they provide trends and some context and some information specific to your site that you can kind of read this little 3-page report. You know, David Gay's been kind of trying to roll that out.
Yeah, we don't like make them into a PDF and send out individual site reports, but we did just or we will. It's coming. It's in draft form, but we have new like site pages where you can look at the TDEP trends at that site. You can look at the ozone trends at W126. It's all interactive. But, you know, if something like that were useful, then I would say put it in the recommendation. And
because I was thinking, you know, like if a site was on tribal lands, you know, you could issue a report every year and make sure it gets into the hands of the, you know, tribal air resources community. They could bring it to the elders and you would say, okay, you know, this pollutant is improving over time or not. And this is what we, you know, just a little bit of interpretation and could be shared maybe on an annual basis. And that might be an idea.
So the first part of the statement was actually talking about making the data more accessible, and especially interpretation, because a lot of the tribal and disadvantaged communities, most of the times the data is technical and out of their league. They don't really make sense out of it. Sometimes they don't even know there's monitoring stations around them, but taking that and making it, put it in a language that is meaningful and impactful to them. That's part of the recommendation. And then of course the EJ screen tools would also help to map or overlay the existing monitoring stations, because if you look at the monitoring stations where they're situated, mostly in the eastern portion of the state and scattered maybe a few towards the west. But if you look down south in Florida, for example, going down, you see just scattered dots. So if there's a way to reassess that based on data that exists and see where the gaps are, and also making the information more accessible to the people. That's basically what I was trying to explain. But incorporating the EJ screening, the climate and economic justice screening too, because that would help to determine where those communities are located.
The Burns, you said something about using existing data. But on the chat question, you said advice on new data analysis.
New data analyses using existing data. So kind of analyzing the data, looking at them in a new way. And that's sort of how I interpret that sentence. I don't know if that's.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I'm more like looking for new ideas.
Because I had this whole thing about PFAS, because I've been involved in that, but then as I look at it, well, that's collecting a new data type that isn't necessarily part of the routine network.
And there's also resources there too. So there might be, I know there's budget cut or reduction looming, but with the resources at hand, this could be, that's a recommendation. Because if we're prioritizing environmental justice and the monitoring stations are sparsely located in certain regions of the country where some of the disadvantaged and tribal communities are, then why not consider that?
And Doug, to your point about the PFAS, I don't remember exactly what you wrote, but it could be incorporated into like those site reports of is PFAS being measured there. So I think it's appropriate.
I'll just underscore, your points about the importance of outreach, but it's not just outreach, because I think we're talking about community science, which is different than citizen science. So in community science, the community is bringing questions to scientists, whereas in citizen science, most often the scientist is saying, we need more data on birds in this place, and asking people to help with that. So the questions are being generated by the communities. And if that's something that CASTNet wants to further pursue, that requires a lot of engagement. I've been working on an environmental justice focused project the past couple of years. Takes a lot of time, a lot of community partners that live and work in the communities who can often act as gatekeepers. And the other piece is, given the communities that I've been working in, we've been translating our outreach pieces into multiple languages. That's a really critical piece. So I'm wondering if EPA may have translation resources that could be brought to bear on some of these types of summaries, which I also mentioned in my comments. Having worked with education researchers on data literacy, I completely agree that looking at a graph with chemical names and looking at a graph in general is typically not well understood, and it takes a lot of writing around that graph to help people understand what's there and really explaining. So if there are resources, maybe from other parts of the agency or partners for professional science communication, science translation, and community outreach engagement work, I think that would be critical if this is a goal.
Yeah, I would agree. And we do fact sheets. So whenever there's a complicated thing to describe, you can't do it for every location, but you can do a really nice fact sheet, translate it into many languages, have it on the website. So if someone has a question, you can say, this is our resource for education. If there's any further questions, contact us here. Absolutely.
Tom, Mr. Brennan,
Yes.
Do you know an estimated amount of money that will be awarded to environmental justice groups nationwide? So far, 177 million have been awarded. So what is the administrator thinking?
Well, obviously, he's making environmental justice one of his top priorities. He often says that the agency should be, the actions we take should be for the least of us. In other words, the people that are struggling and getting by, that's where environmental protection needs to focus on. And he's definitely taken a very strong regional approach. The regional offices are all very focused on environmental justice and trying to make those connections and improve lives that way. So it is, without question, I would say climate and environmental justice are two areas of focus that have been integrated into our whole mission in a stronger sense under Mr. Regan, and he cares deeply about it.
Which means that we have to find a way to work with the EJ communities, maybe in education and outreach, because they have money. And the important thing about money is that if you don't direct it to appropriately, then it will just come and go. So it becomes another tool, another source of resources to strengthen the EJ issues in those communities.
Wondering if the groups that received the money, if there was, I'm sure there are stipulations on what type of EJ work that they would do with that, and if that includes Dr. Brennan, if it includes air monitoring, or I think somebody said something about there was a specific thing that they were supposed to do with the money. Can't remember now.
Well, I can say in a generic level, when the agency gives out grants, so some of you might have won grants from this agency or others, you know, the money is for the benefit of the person who wins the grant. So the EPA cannot be over the top telling the researcher or the group that won the grant what to do. However, in the application for the grant that gets evaluated, they describe what they'll do. And some of it, I'm sure, is outreach, communication, measurement, community involvement, whatever the grant specifies. And I don't know all the details, but I know enough to know that we've gotten quite a variety of different grants and different focus on these grants. And so there's a lot of activity going on. Now, a lot of them are in the process of being awarded. I don't think they're fully engaged yet. We all know how grants work, is that the money goes out and then the work begins. So I don't think we really realize the benefit of that yet, but it's happening and it's very exciting.
Yeah, and I know that some money has been awarded, and it might be part of it for vulnerable communities to live in flood-prone areas, for nature-based flood mitigation projects and education on climate science and other things. So, including incorporating air monitoring at any level would be really great.
The one thing we've been asked to every community group, if they want to co-locate with us, if we have space or access, we say, sure. EPA is now providing co-location shelters, which are like 4 feet by 4 feet, 6 feet tall with louvers. And you can put sensors inside them next to your monitoring station so that you get essentially co-located data without having people go into your monitoring station and who shouldn't be there 24 hours a day, but they have access to their equipment and your data set. So they can sort of tie or tether their data to yours, especially ozone, because it's hourly. And they might want to throw a PM sensor in there. You never know. So it's a way to interact, at least with the data, without having to be there and help them directly.
So just a reminder, I think what's best for this group is to think in the context maybe of that table we were talking about. If there's, maybe new ways to put some of the data together that we already have that might meet some of those objectives that is not currently being done, very similar to what you were talking about with the NADP effort or other things. So.
Okay, is that it?
I think that the idea of using the data already collected and model assessments to do more detailed exposure assessments for DAC and tribal communities would be valuable. We're starting to see those pop up in the peer-reviewed literature now over the past few years. And I always find those very valuable in helping to winnow down, again, whether it's a key pollutant parameter or time of exposure, that's really valuable. So those I think are things that are happening naturally, but if there's a way that CASTNet can suggest, opportunities that they would like to see the data used for, that is certainly one.
Okay, we're gonna head down to discussion of key points, responding to the chat questions by the lead writers. And then we will begin with the chat question number 1, Dr. Burns.
So Doug, don't forget your mic. So can you hear it online?
Yeah. Yeah, I went through the notes that I took while we were having discussions of question 1. And so I'll just share what I sort of have so far, which were, my opinion about what were the most, salient points that people raised. A lot of ours is maybe less recommendation focused, more just an assessment of where things kind of stand today and maybe what the risks are or could be in the future. But so the first one one part A is provide high quality data on ambient concentrations of the pollutants and other forms of atmospheric pollution. And I think we generally agreed that CASTNet collects high quality data today. The data are readily available. There's good documentation of data quality. All that's available on the website. So I think there's general agreement about data quality. People generally, I think, said they thought the frequency of data collection was appropriate, hourly for ozone and then weekly for the filter packs, that's meeting program goals. People, some people raise the point, of course, that if a large number of sites are eliminated, that might jeopardize, the word ability is in that, the ability to realize geographic coverage goals in the future. I think we all realize that. Let's see. One suggestion that was offered in this part of the discussion was that there would be value in better coordination with existing monitoring networks like SLAMs, that they sort of operate independently, and there could be some optimization through better coordination among the various monitoring networks that are out there on the landscape, that there could be mutual benefit to that, to CASTNet and others. We talked about how CASTNet data are available in air now. And the question was raised, if a certain amount of CASTNet data were lost, would that jeopardize the calculation of the air quality index or air quality predictions? And so that maybe should be a consideration, as there's consideration given to eliminating sites. The ability to calculate that AQI for certain locations. That's about all I had for key points in 1A. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about anything I overlooked that came up in the discussion.
So one general point in considering these summaries is, if you're making a recommendation, is there sort of like a tier in which the recommendation fits? So like, for example, is there something that absolutely must be done, or you're recommending really absolutely must be done, or is it a nice to do, or, if you get around to it in 10 years, that would be great, kind of tiering maybe.
When we review, we do these external reviews of NADP. I just participated in one, and we have, what do we call our must do? There's recommendations or things you should consider doing. And then the other tier is things the panel is saying, you really ought to do this. You really should do this. So you can kind of tier things that way. Like, these are high priority things, give this serious consideration. We can't tell you absolutely have to do it.
Right.
Recommendations are just kind of for your consideration.
Right. And so this is kind of general for everybody, and I'm just using this
Yeah.
as the first example of that. But like, when I heard you talk about doing the evaluation of CASTNet's input into the air now, that sounds like a really, must do critical thing. And then, maybe one of the, evaluating the frequency, weekly to biweekly, maybe that's not as intense a need, perhaps, just as an example.
And as I was saying that, of course, I hadn't really given deep thought to like what would be involved in that type of analysis. For compelling these guys to do that, do they have the readily available personnel resources to make those sorts of assessments?
And you're not compelling them, you're advising them. The
Yeah.
agency will reserve the right to make its
Yeah.
own decisions ultimately. But, just to be able to give a sense of, however you get to that, tier 1 versus tier 2, whether it's an urgency issue or whether it's a critical use issue or whatever. I mean, that's kind of up to you guys. I'm just using this example so that everybody can consider, how
Should
they
we
might tier
agree
their
on
recommendations.
some sort of way to present this in our now so that everyone can use the same system?
Yeah, and I don't know that that's necessary. You will
Yeah.
have a chance to go back and revisit this when we have the summary report.
Okay.
So, just taking an initial stab at it, and then you guys can, evaluate holistically when you have the whole report in front of you. If you want to create consistency at that point, it'd be probably easier to do then.
So we should consider maybe tiering our recommendations or suggestions. Yeah. Okay. All right. The second part of this is the ability of CASTNet to monitor, assess, and report on spatial patterns as well as temporal trends in air concentrations and atmospheric deposition of pollutants. And I took some of what I had written and some of the notes that I took, but I think we generally agree that there's pretty good geographic coverage, although there was a fairly extensive discussion of this kind of missing sites kind of from North Dakota to Texas. We had a pretty extensive discussion about that, is why is that gap exists, and is that something that CASTNet should consider trying to fill in the future? I'm not sure if we want to make a recommendation along those lines, but maybe we just want to point out that that is a geographic gap in the coverage. I mean, I think they explained why the history of why that exists. And what came out in the panel discussion is that this area could be important because it's likely an area of high agricultural emissions, probably ammonia and maybe NOx and things like that from the landscape. So that's why it could potentially be important. So that's what kind of came up in the context of a spatial gap.
Doug, I had a quick piece on that. I think it came out of the discussions as we were thinking about the big table. Last night, a couple of us wondered about potential to conduct a sensitivity analysis using the previously collected data and, looking at what happens if you remove a particular set of sites or spatial density or temporal density to inform recommendations. So we kind of wondered if that was a potential way to help quantify
what would be your like objective when you do that? You have to have like an objective function, right? What would?
Yeah, and I guess it would be different for the different parameters that are measured, but looking at looking at the previously collected data and subtracting, X number of sites and seeing what your error bars look like, or subtracting sites in various regions, just statistically, just to get a sense of how well the network would have quantified some of these things in a different configuration. Just sort of looking to the previous data to think about, what are the implications of changing the network?
The way
Particularly-
NADP likes to do this, I probably said it, I don't know if people like that, but they have rules for what it takes to draw the map.
Right.
And in certain sites, when they get removed, shrink the map. And that's been a big consideration for NADP, like don't remove a site that's going to cause this major shrinkage of the map because there's too much distance and other criteria between sites. That is one way to look at it. But there are other ways too. You could look at some sort of regional metrics and see if removing sites increases your error bars or things like that. Yeah. Okay.
Doug, on B, would you recommend installing AMON only sites as opposed to entire CASTNet sites in the middle of the country where you're concerned about ammonia?
That would be a probably low hanging fruit for that part of the country.
Yeah, I mean, as a
Yeah.
recommendation, that would be a lot less expensive than a whole site and might get the needed information.
I'll add that.
Yeah, and the clarifying comment question was, is that a recommendation for EPA or for CASTNet? And your answer was both. I believe we also have Dr. Mao online if you wanted to ask her about the,
Well, she was the one to raise that point.
yeah, about the gap in coverage and maybe if there's a suggested recommendation there.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks. The other thing, well, ammonia obviously is a low hanging fruit. The other one is NO, the NOx emissions from soils and from agricultural activities due to the microbial activities and also probably fertilization. Thanks.
Yep. The other point that came up, and I was talking to Dr. Clifton about this, was that she raised a point in this context that CASTNet calculates an ozone concentration, but they don't provide a deposition value. Whereas for sulfur and nitrogen, there are provided deposition values, based on models and assumptions. Just wondering, if that should be considered. After we sort of spoke about it, I think in order to do that, it would require some additional meteorological measurements. So that might be something that would be possibly cost prohibitive, but that kind of information would be useful for those who study ozone, is to have an actual estimate of ozone deposition rather than just a concentration.
Question number 6. That's a new analysis of existing data.
Yeah.
No, the data isn't existing.
Well, I thought there were.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just turn your mic on and speak into the mic.
I thought there were some sites that had net data. Is that not true?
So there's sites with met data that used to be fed into a dry deposition model. And if we were to measure eddy covariance fluxes of ozone, that would require different meteorology. You'd have to get a sonic anemometer. And so it's a bit different.
And so I'm curious about, is modeled meteorology not sufficient for that? I mean, generally speaking, evaluation of
I
net
guess
models is pretty good. In
it's not,
most
it's to
locations.
calculate the eddy covariance flux, you need the 3D winds really fast. And so that would be the new instrument. It wouldn't be for,
So like 1 minute type.
yeah, 1 second or less.
Yeah, and not to interrupt the flow of the conversation or making sure that but I did want to do a quick time check. So it's 10 o'clock now, and we wanted to have a discussion about schedule and delivery of draft report at 11. And I haven't gotten any requests for public comment. So we ostensibly have at this point 60 minutes for the other 5 questions without a break. So
Okay. So I'll keep moving along here. So the third one is about the data serving as a platform for air quality and deposition research, as well as the ecological assessments. And, several things came up, I think, that were positive in that way, about CASTNet data actually providing a platform for research and assessment. I mentioned the CLAD committee and NADP. CASTNet data is a part of their assessment of ecological harm, if you will, across the nation. They've created a tool that allows people to do that on a location-based basis. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything more we want to say. It was mostly positive feedback on that point. The data serving as a platform.
So not to rush or anything, but I think at this point, just to kind of go over the high level, maybe tier 1 kind of recommendations for each subsection, just to see if there's any substantive disagreement amongst the group, as you head into the writing task, and then we'll need to probably move on. So we'll have about 12 minutes per question for the remaining questions.
Okay. So you want me to stand down? Is that what you're saying? That's fine. I'll stand down.
Well, just before you do that though, just briefly think, are there any like tier one recommendations for the remaining questions that you haven't touched on that you'd want to run by to see if there's any disagreement?
Not really, I don't think. No, I don't think in those remaining. No, I don't think anything rose to the point of like a new recommendation.
NE, does it concern you? The levels proposed for the ozone max potentially could really change things as far as which sites are critical and which aren't.
But that's kind of hypothetical at this point, isn't it?
It's gonna happen probably this year.
Yeah, but we don't know what the
No,
administrator's gonna
no,
do. I mean, we could say that that's something that ought to be considered if new standards are implemented. Certainly.
I'll just jump in on that. I think that's an interesting thought, but if I were going to do that, I would couch it over time. As standards adjust over time, these tools could be helpful
Yeah.
and not really predict what might happen in the short term.
Okay.
That way the recommendation will be more evergreen.
Mhm.
And
Okay. All right. No, you can go on to the next.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next is Dr. Graham, charge question 2.
So on the screen, just a reminder, this question was looking at the strategic plan and CASTNet and seeing how those objectives and goals of CASTNet and the objectives and goals for the strategic plan sort of align and highlight where those things do align, to the extent that they do. I think that this is, my approach is going to be, working with Sarah and Dr. Uzo, will be to use the table that we've got sort of as the high line, refer to the key results from question 1, which are highlighting what are the accomplishments and abilities of CASTNet and to meet its own objectives, and then see how that aligns with the strategic plan elements. And then, then we'll move into the aspect of the question that's about, with changes in the network, how does that ability shift? Presumably it can only get worse if we're reducing the amount of information we're bringing to the table, and assess, okay, in that realm, can we still achieve all the same things that we were able to do before? And if not, how far below that level of accomplishment can we get? And, is that a critical loss that we can't afford to undergo? And then I think we'll have to also refer to some of the elements of the other questions that are thinking about, well, what are some of the other modifications that can be made that are more directed towards the new reframing of really focused on climate and EJ aspects, as opposed to, I think originally it was more in just the pure environmental health of people and, the ecosystem that was the CASTNet focus, and sort of reframing it and seeing how any new analyses and data products that might come out of a changed network would either fill in the gaps that it currently doesn't meet as it relates to the strategic plan, but also, and a lot of that I think might be more focused on EJ, because I don't think that the original network was set with that as its overarching theme. And so I think it's not obvious how those things coincide. But so that's generally the approach that we'll take in writing this up. I don't think we had any major disagreements or, about this sort of how that all comes together. And because this part isn't so much recommendations as it is observations about the ability to meet the various goals. But I do think there's an element here to say, if you don't meet these goals that it should be able to meet, why is that, and what could be done to make sure that it is able to better meet those. So if anyone has anything to add, I think, especially Sarah and Dr. Uzo, but, anyone else. Otherwise, I think, the way, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the approach is we'll write something and then we're all going to get a chance to review it. And if we've missed some key element, then that's going to be our opportunity to really make sure that we get every detail in there that needs to be.
Yes, I'm also supportive of what Dr. Graham said, because everything we are saying here is riding on the strategic plan. All of them must fit in the plan. They will also be measurable and achievable.
So that's what I have. If anyone else, if there's no one else that has more to add to that, then we probably can move on to the next question. But I don't know, Dr. Mao, did you have anything to add to this section?
Oh, no, I completely agree with what you have presented. That was very nice. Thanks.
Okay, let's go to Katie Pradell.
Thank you. Could you enable my screen sharing, Brian? Or if not, I'll just kind of go.
Well, he's doing it now. He'll give you a
Okay.
thumbs up when you got it.
All right.
Thumb is up.
There you go.
Just getting go. Okay, so I just summarized this in these slides to make it a more of a visual person. So this question was kind of, I think, almost prompting us to consider the shutdowns and perhaps, you know, realistically say no. So this was very much once we kind of decided that the proposed scenarios didn't work is why Dr. Shaw came up with the idea to come up with the matrices that will heavily reference in this. The only kind of decision I think we came to that I'd like to bring back to the group is the only acceptable potential reduction for consideration is the reduction in frequency of filter pack collection. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. And if anybody has any major concerns with that, I think now would be the time to raise those. All right, moving on. So this is just kind of an introduction in the write-up will include why we know that CASTNet is important and all the discussion points that were made here. And again, we're offering no suspension or operational reductions, but we understand that that's not necessarily realistic. So we wanted to give EPA a longer term tool to prioritize sites and based on, you know, all the work that we put in over the last 2 days. So these were the really high level objectives that I think this group finds valuable. And I wanted to include a picture of a CASTNet site. This is our CASTNet site in Wisconsin. This one does look like it does have MET. And then if you can see, this is a co-located site. It has an ADP. This is the really bad looking one is the state and local site. And then the nice looking one is the CASTNet site. So you can see the different investments that have been made. But again, it's tough to keep these sites going. If you look at the background, the cost is expensive. You need to hire snow plowers, grass cutters, things like people don't normally think of. And even getting internet to these sites is difficult. So just wanted to kind of illustrate there what a site actually looks like. But the objectives are really important. And I've learned a lot just being a state, local, tribal agency in that I didn't value these as much as I will now, you know, based on all the feedback we got. So it's been a great learning experience. And all of these objectives fed into this, this metric that will be used. And then so we'll heavily reference this in our response. And then this is kind of like all the ideas that were presented with the last two parts of the question. So capturing extreme events. I think that it kind of speaks to climate change a little bit in that all the things that are necessary to capture extreme events are also necessary to capture climate change. So I'll try to figure out how to incorporate all of these kind of other things for future iterations of network changes. And then cost efficiencies, that'll be kind of another probably 2 paragraphs based on these two higher level questions. Any concerns with that approach?
So,
I guess it's a question, but we're not, according to our charge, supposed to consider individual sites. But if I recall, nearly all of the public comment were folks discussing particular regions or sites that have potentially already been discontinued recently. And I wondered if this section should mention any of that, because there already has been a temporary or permanent reduction, a suspension of sites.
So we would make a recommendation on whether or not those would remain shut down, because they're kind of mothballed right now, which I don't know if that's our call, but I think that's where that's a good point though, because we should incorporate the public comments, and this is a good question for that. So I think I could find a way to do that by referencing the table, probably, with the ones that have been shut down, perhaps they could be kind of reevaluated using that table with respect to, like, the whole network could be evaluated using the table, including the ones that have been mothballed, and then they could kind of justify their shutdown.
I think that's why they were mothballed and not completely removed.
Right.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that discussion can be, well, what are the near-term impacts that we've already seen by the fact that they stopped operating? Like, is there anything we've already learned from their removal? I don't know that that analysis can be done, but I mean, if there's any, beside the fact that there's a lot of, oh crap, response from the people who had been, I mean, really, that is what it is. Like, this is for those people who have been relying on these sites as a key basis for all kinds of studies over the years, their realization of it's now no longer available to us. I mean, that's one element that I think that, I don't know if this is the right place, but if we're going to discuss that, I think that's the first evidence that we have to say, what are impacts of reducing the network? And we have like real world observations that we can use.
I have a question for EPA, Dr. Poshasky. Okay. In the sites, I saw in one of our documents, 99 or so sites there. Did they indicate which ones were discontinued? Because it's a whole list, but is there somewhere there where it was noted the ones that were discontinued?
In the site list that's provided on the SAB website?
Yes, I think so.
I don't remember
Brian?
if I
anything I have?
indicated that, but they are on our, indicated on the map on our website.
Yeah, so I don't think it was in that table, but we can add it. And,
Yeah,
it is indicated on the CASTNet website.
okay.
Yeah, so there's two sources of information there, but the one that we posted and shared with the panel will add a flag to it, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add for capturing extreme events, the, high quality, consistent, long-term record is just so key, because you're trying to tease apart the influence of a lot of different changes on the trends and variability.
Thank you.
Okay, ready for the next one?
I'd
Krista?
just like to,
Okay.
Dr. Mao is on my panel too, so if you have anything to add.
Oh, thanks. I'm good. Thank you.
Is that it?
That's it.
Okay, Dr. Pfister?
Okay, thank you. So we are moving on to question 4. And question 4 was really about additional new measurements that could be considered with one-time funding. And we actually, Dr. Clifton and I put together a slide, and let me just, why do I not Oh, thanks. It's the big green button. Okay, I don't think you all want to see my email. Okay, so we can, so just some of the key points that we took away from the meeting. First of all, I want to start with 3 overarching comments. So one is that whatever addition of new instruments is considered, should also basically weigh the balance between new instrumentation and updating, modernizing the current instrumentation. I think that's really an important part to ensure that the sites can continue operating in the future. The value of new measurements needs definitely also be evaluated in the context of the measurement and research activities of other branches of the EPA, of other agencies and programs. And I know that we've heard it in some of the other questions already. And a long-term operation should also be prioritized with adding new or changing instrumentation. So we don't want to have a new measurement that's being done for a year and then it stops again. I don't think that's a value for CASTNet. So then there were 6 additional new measurements were actually proposed. And what we feel that there was a majority of the panel really leaned towards putting priority on a replacement or expansion of ozone monitors and or the addition of passive ammonia measurements. And versus the other ones, while they were seen as of value for one or other point, they didn't rank quite that high in priority. I just go quickly through them. So the allergen measurements, they do clearly have a relevance for health, but it's really not clear if this is an area of big interest or if this is really EPA's responsibility. And also if it's about the health relevance, then should it be better suited to be done to start the network to be done in more populated areas. So maybe worth something for SLAMS monitors. EPA would use the pollen as climate indicators, but we also feel like that there's other parameters that can inform about this task. So it's not necessarily the highest priority with limited funds. We also find that allergen measurements would benefit from the CASTNet measurements and the infrastructure, but we don't really see that there is a big benefit to the current really CASTNet measurements and objectives. And there was also a comment made that automated sensors, they're cheap, you can really throw them out wherever you want, but they do need extra quality assurance, quality control. The technology is privately owned, so it's not that cheap at the end to operate them if you want to get meaningful data out. The other black carbon in precipitation, we fully acknowledge that understanding the black carbon sink is key information, but we also find it's of less value unless you have ambient concentration measurements. So otherwise you really only have one piece of the puzzle. It's also found that it's more of a research topic, maybe not quite yet ready for prime time, but what could be considered is there is 3 ascent sites coinciding at CASTNet sites, and they have ambient BC measurements, they have a lot of other measurements, and CASTNet could consider a pilot study, adding there also PET deposition of black carbon and see what really additional value you can gain for it. If they go for the adding black carbon in precipitation, then really the most value would be to put the measurements up at snow-covered remote stations, so Rocky Mountains, for example. There was also discussion about continuous PM2.5 measurements, which we fully acknowledge is really important for health. It can also help as a fire tracer, and it can help to constrain non-measured aerosol components, since we have some other aerosol component measured. There is a range of different PM2.5 sensors, and EPA might want to consider adding low-cost sensors, for example, purple air, at all the sites, plus also doing then some regulatory measurements at sites that are above or near the NACs, or where we find also large organic fractions, so where you really need more detailed information about the aerosol composition. There was also suggestion about enhanced wildfire tracers, which we don't see of that big a value. PM2.5 would in that case be a much more versatile fire tracer. And if you have something like PM2.5 that also could help you indicate whether filter packs should be retested for something like levoglucosan. We also want to bring up that if you measure any of the fire-specific tracers, it's not a straightforward issue to relate that to impacts on ozone, PM, or on ecological impacts. It's not a one-to-one relationship. And what CASTNet might want to consider is including a fire flag into their CASTNet data, so that could be based on existing smoke products that are widely available, so that you have a feeling for when you analyze the data, or there might have been fire influence. So the two topics that we give the highest priority is really the replacement or the expansion of ozone monitors. We really need consistent high quality data to look at, to assess trends that are related to climate as well as emission changes. And so continuing the ozone measurements at the CASTNet sites is really crucial. There is lower cost instrumentation is becoming available. And so EPA could consider, in order to save costs, transferring part of the network to a lower grade sensors. But then you really need to make sure, in order to ensure consistency in the data set within acceptable bounds, that you co-locate the measurements of all the new instruments that should be done for at least a year to cover all the different seasons. And the placement of regulatory grade sensors should be prioritized at sites where you find poor model performance, where there is a lack of nearby SNL sites, at sites that represent true background conditions. And there's also really a need to retain the capability in the Western US, where we just have a little bit less coverage and less knowledge. And then we also felt strongly for supporting passive ammonia measurements. We know that emission regimes change, ammonia is becoming more important, and some studies have shown that there is an increasing trend. So it's really increasingly becoming an important fraction of PM 2.5. So continuation of the current coverage and the expansion should be a high priority. And EPA might also want to consider a higher time resolution, as that would be really of benefit for estimates of dry deposition. We understand there is a way that we get dry deposition information out also of the biweekly samples, but if more information would definitely be gained with hourly resolution, given the diurnal cycle and the variability. So, and that's basically what we see as the key points, and I'd be happy to take any other comments or objections.
Dr. Mao, do you have a question?
Oh, I just rubbed my nose. Okay, but yes, I was wondering about the passive ammonium sampling, and I totally agree. I think that's a great point. However, regarding passive ammonium sampling, there can be confounding issues. For instance, the future collected ammonia is likely interfered with a particular phase ammonium and evaporation of ammonia. And so what is collected on the filter or on a passive sampler may not be real ammonia. I mean, this can be found in a very early reference. So to me, I think, you know, the automated instrument, Dr. Pachowski, I'm sorry, did I mispronounce her name? Melissa presented on the first day. I think that kind of automated instrument can be really, really useful. Thanks.
Thanks, that's a really good information to have. Yeah, and we should include that too. Yeah, please.
Okay. Dr. Pfister, I've been thinking about this for a long time. When we talk about aeroallergen coming up from pollen, okay, from trees and from water, from all kinds of sources, is that an EPA issue or HHS issue? Who owns it? Because here's my point. The people, I don't have allergies, so I can live in New York, Wisconsin, no problem. I can breathe anything. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, when people have allergies, it's a serious health issue. Some with their eyes and their bodies and so on are knocked off. So how does EPA come into this? We can't cut down all the trees. We can't clean out all the things. So let's, I'm thinking about it, but maybe some people may be thinking along with me. somebody shed some light on that?
Yeah, and I have, this is why we posted as a question, because it's not obvious to us. It's definitely, I agree with you. It's something that you cannot control. You cannot put any controls on the trees when they give pollen. So yeah, it is, for us, it was not clear that this is really EPA's priority, but if there is not any other, and that would be very, appreciative if somebody could shed light into that, who is really, if there is any agency that has responsibility for it.
Mr. Bremen, Dr. Bruma.
Yeah, I think what, so I don't personally know the answer to that question. So I think what we'll do is, since the panel's asked it, we'll take that back and I'll send you guys an answer when we research it and get you the truth. So.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, and yesterday, in addition to like CDC, it seems like they're already doing something or on this, Health and Human Services, but the agricultural department sounds like they might have a particular interest in that. So there may be other agencies, even if they don't know that it should be their priority, that it should be. I mean, that's not for us to decide, but
Sounds good. Okay, let's go to Dr. Mao.
Hey, I would like to share my screen. Just so that everyone can look at it. Oh, I'm still not able to share the screen.
Yeah, I think they just flipped the switch, so you should be able to do so now.
Oh, cool. All right, thank you. Okay, so this is what I had from yesterday's discussion. So first of all, modernizing networks. I mean, it wasn't really clear to me, maybe clear to others, that we had a consensus, but I just noted the strongest voices on these 2 points. One is modernizing networks. So online instruments and neural techniques will save effort and resources in the long run and provide continuous real-time data, which will be critical to evaluating impacts of climate change, extreme exceptional events, and the changing emission profiles. Specific sites or regions could be upgraded with enhanced measurement payloads, such as the VOC system and or continuous high resolution ammonia and aerosol composition instruments tailored to the specific problems. NOx and meteorological measurements should be deployed at all sites, as these are fundamental for understanding the drivers of ozone exceedances, deposition, and transport. And the other one is the low-cost sensors. They can provide real-time data near residences in non-compliance and rural communities and address the spatial coverage issue. Visualization of sensor hourly real-time data together with the future pack data should be made accessible to rural and tribal communities near CASTNet sites. So these 2 really got a very strong support. And we also talked about expansion of tribal sites. Since the new tribal sites are mostly located in the Great Plains in the middle of the nation, so it would fill the monitoring gap in that region. Okay, so this one, measurements of meteorology, not just temperature, but also precipitation, solar radiation, relative humidity, wind. These are important. And the long-term meteorological data are essential for quantifying climate change. Use isotope techniques to analyze archived samples and using existing isotopic data, for instance, for isotopic signatures of ammonia and organic nitrogen in aerosols for source attribution studies. And we also think EPA should support MDN's deployment of mercury's passive samplers, because mercury is tribal communities' top concern. And we also would like to suggest that EPA consider dry deposition fluxes of reactive gases. Also, we recommend measurements of formaldehyde. And the other one is the process analysis of nighttime versus daytime chemistry and a long-range transport using existing data. The results and findings can be used for not only process understanding, but can also potentially aid in assessing the relevance and significance of a site. The last one probably should fall into question number 6, basically, now that I think about it. So I refer to Doctors Shaw, Burns, and Dirk and all other panelists for more input. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Any comments? Good. Okay. Dr.
Yeah,
Nolo?
I think that was a great summary. I'll just suggest that I think there were some sort of high, medium, low priorities given in the prior discussion. So you might want to incorporate that in the
Yes.
slides here.
Okay, sorry. I kind of mentioned this in passing. On the first slides, those 2 points got the strongest voices. Thanks.
Yeah, and actually, if I remember from yesterday, you also had 2 that were similarly grouped as like they were highlighted in red. I don't remember exactly what
yes.
that meant.
Okay, so in the report, I also include the other responses. These ones, the panel thought it was the lowest of the lowest priorities. But in the report, in the written report, I will write about those ones.
Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I was clear when we go to compile the final report,
Yes.
which ones are in which category.
I'll
And that's
try to-
actually quite a lot in that middle tier. So I don't know if you have like a relative ranking of those or if they're all of equal weight, but that's perhaps if they're not all of equal weight, some indicator about either what you see as the difficulty of addressing one, maybe in terms of dealing with that time horizon component you discussed yesterday about, some of these can't be done immediately, but they're important to think about maybe longer term. Maybe that's a way of structuring this middle tier so there can be some differentiation to help the agency sort of prioritize and advocate for resources if they want to go after it.
That's a great point. I'll take care of that. Oh, well, of course, with everyone else's help. Thanks.
Thank you.
One way we've differentiated that is calling one a suggestion, which is a little lighter, and the other a strong recommendation, which is a little, higher priority. That could be a way we could differentiate too.
That's a
We
great
could never
point.
say probably must, but a stronger recommendation, strong recommendation.
Okay, thanks. I've taken note of that. Thank you.
Is that it? Okay, Dr. Nolo?
Okay, so in light of this last discussion, I am going to frame this short summary because charge question 6, it's really short and well discussed. So I'm going to call this recommendations based on what Dr. Burns said. The overarching recommendation from all the comments is that US EPA prioritize monitoring and measurement of PFAS and PAS within the regulatory committee, and especially in the disadvantaged communities, which include tribal communities. Another recommendation was for a creation of fact sheets. This came up during discussion with specific pollutant information for disadvantaged communities and other stakeholders, by the way, so they can better understand what the data analyzed means to their lives. Another recommendation was for creation of a user-friendly data dashboard that is again user-friendly with interpreted data summaries on the specific pollutants information collected from the monitoring stations. And this should be done with the help of professional science communicators and also scientists, so that the information is factual but relevant to the stakeholders. Another suggestion is, I'm sorry, not suggestion, recommendation is engagement of rural and disadvantaged communities in setting priorities for the new data analysis that will meet their community needs, but also incorporating education on the relevant data that is collected. I think I have a few more. Another suggestion is to incorporate the use of the climate and economic justice screening tool for assessment of gaps in location of existing monitoring sites and prioritization of specific community relevant air quality data collection. This will be suggestion / recommendation, adoption of portable and portable air monitoring equipments that will give real-time air quality monitoring measurements for these disadvantaged communities so they can understand exactly what's going on in their neighborhoods or their communities to make informed decision. And then lastly, recommendation was to use satellite data and model to analyze pollution transport to and from CASTNet sites and their representative footprint. I believe this was from Dr. Pfister. I believe that that recommendation there. And also to determine the CASTNet sites that are in places where exposure information would be relevant to the rural and tribal communities. That's all I have for question number 6. So if I missed anything or any other thing should be added, please let me know.
Any comments? Can we have that in writing?
Yes, I can
Send it to Dr.
Yes.
Bruma?
Okay.
Okay, very good. Okay, folks, we're gonna take 10 minutes break. So we'll be back at 10:50.
I think I have the answer to all this. Just a quick thing. There's now, you can claim that your data set that you collect is a World Heritage data set. Have you heard about this? And it says if it's accepted, then their premise is that to discontinue this data set would be irresponsible and illogical. So one of my colleagues said, maybe we could make NADP a World Heritage data set. Of course, that's not really going to stop what needs to be done, but I thought that was interesting that there's this program now.
That's a very fun thought. Yeah, and so on that, we'll take a 10-minute recess, get comfortable, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the report writing process and how we'll bring this ultimately to closure.
Example of that World Heritage data set.
Yeah.
How do we want to go over that?
Yeah, I have a.
Yeah.
Can you tell me
It's
more
a-
about that? Because when that happened, all my.
It's really interesting because, you know, we probably aren't measuring some of the hazardous pollutants, but all we can say is based on the data we collect. Like David Gay, who's the coordinator of NEDB, just looked at stations in the weeks following that. And
If you want.
oh, sorry.
You can
Sorry.
think about at the quality review stage, where this report gets presented to the full Chartered Science Advisory Board, you know, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that alone. Like you can get one or more volunteers from this group.
After they submit all their drafts.
Right.
Yes, yes, sure. That makes sense. Invite them as
Okay.
speakers.
Yeah, so I'll just leave that as an open thing and
No,
you'll
no, it's
decide
great,
during the.
great idea, because they probably will respond more to the sections that they wrote.
Right, and so if there's any questions or anything like that, it'd be good to have their expertise.
Get it? That's the way to go.
Okay, all right, so I'll mention that when I talk about quality review.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good.
I don't think we fully understand. But it's clear. No, David was shocked about all the kids. And then the opposite way it went up, more basic, which surprised me.
Well, I wonder if what happened.
Well, that's what I was thinking, maybe It was such intense burn that it was actually considering soils that are formed of limestone. I don't know, that was just a thought. But what was interesting is he looked at how long these anomalies persist. In some cases, especially close to the site, the changes that are.
So I think we're about ready to get started and wrap up.
We could start.
We got planes to catch, right?
So if we could get seated and we'll get started again.
Over the years.
So if we could get seated, we'll get started again. We'll probably get everybody out of here a little early, so you'll have time to talk further after we complete this next step. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody back. Thank you. And so what we're going to do from here is we'll open with a few overarching thoughts from Dr. Uzo as your chair, and then he'll hand it back to me, and I'll go through sort of the big steps of the report writing process that involve the panelists, and then we'll talk schedule. So, Dr. Uzo.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bloomer. It's been an exciting meeting. Outstanding panels, panel members. And we hope that we'll continue to do outstanding work in the days ahead. The presentation of this report to the full SAB board will be coming up, and we'll let you know. And we plan to invite you to attend the board meeting in case if there are questions about the areas that you chaired, so we can provide a consensus answer to that. So this is thinking ahead. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next tomorrow, but put it in the back of your head. And Dr. Buma will keep us informed, and Tom Brennan, let us know when that time comes. But the task at hand is to draft the report, and I think we're capable. I have confidence in all of you. Probably present the administrator and Tom and Dr. Bruma and all the team exemplary report, because our work is going to be the best when it's done. I know IPA measures that, but I believe that we'll give them the best that they have seen.
I can stamp that as the best. It's on comes.
Right. So I turn it over to Dr. Buma to talk about the schedule of the report.
Okay, so thank you very much. And so the report process has sort of three major steps. So the first step, we're heading into sort of the completion phase of. So it's the taking of the charge, the public deliberations on the charge, and the arrival at your key recommendations. And now we're moving into the writing of the report that supports and provides the context for understanding those recommendations, provides any additional information. For example, we talked yesterday about possible additional analyses that you might want to demonstrate and include as an appendix. You know, all of these kinds of things, we're entering into that period where they have to be written up, and the teams reach some agreement as to this is the material that we're in agreement on, and you'll submit that to me as the designated federal officer, and I'll work with Dr. Uzo, your chair, to craft a complete draft report that's written in one voice, because it's a consensus. Ultimately, it's going to be a consensus report of this panel to the chartered board, and through the chartered board to the administrator and the agency. So we're in the stage where the teams are going to draft the material that they want to write up, and they're going to email that to me. And then the next step will be Dr. Uzo and I will draft the draft report, and we'll send that back out for another public meeting. So we'll post that report to the SAB website, the draft report, and you all will convene, and we'll do that by teleconference to discuss that draft report and to arrive as to whether or not it's ready to go, or if it needs revision, and how extensive those revisions are, and whether or not we think it's ready with perhaps minor revisions to transmit to the board. The revisions will be made. I'll survey you by email for final concurrence on the final draft that incorporates those revisions. And upon your concurrence, we'll post that draft report to the SAB website for quality review and submission to the full chartered Science Advisory Board. So the quality review will consist of the Chartered Science Advisory Board establishing a subcommittee that will evaluate 4 questions with respect to the report, and I'll provide those questions to you. The details of those questions are not important right now. And the board will deliberate on the report. And so that's what Dr. Uzo was referring to, and that you're all invited, and perhaps, you know, at the review of the draft meeting, there may be a couple of people that you want to appoint as your spokespeople to represent you at the quality review. That's totally up to you, and you guys can think about that. You don't have to decide any of that now. And then the charter board will vote on the disposition of the report. They'll either fully adopt it and transmit it as is, or they'll adopt it and transmit it upon some minor revisions that they suggest. And a third possibility, which is extremely rare, they might send it back to the panel for further work. I don't expect that to happen. So are there any questions about these broad sort of general categories? You know, the writing process, the approval of the draft process, and then the final approval by the full chartered Science Advisory Board.
Just that there are no individual comments tacked on at the end, like in some other panels.
Well, if there's significant disagreement about a point, you know, sometimes that's how the group will resolve it, by deciding to include like a minority opinion or specific individual comments. But this report for the Chartered Science Advisory Board, you know, the ideal is for it to be a consensus report, not representing anybody's individual opinions.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
My question is more about the content of the report, because the questions are very specific and they have like sub questions. Is that how you would like the report written, to respond to each individual question? Because I think we kind of got to a place where we're responding to all of them with higher level goals and objectives.
Well, ultimately, how you structure your report is up to you, but typically the reports are structured by charge question.
Also, if you look at the chat questions, in most cases asking for our opinion, what we think. So on that basis, I think we'll tell them what we think.
Yeah, and if you have opinions that sort of cross questions, you know, we can coordinate on making sure that it gets represented like in one place, if that makes the most sense, and where that place would be. And then we can talk about it in the introductory material, how that orientation should be taken when reading the report.
So I have a question on that introduction. We all will have our own responsible areas that are directly related to the charge questions, but when we write that, is that then going to go to the chair and Dr. Uzo will write the introduction, or how is that sort of unifying all of the pieces part going to be written? Is that, I'm assuming that gets written after we each individually write the sections, and then who's responsible for that major?
Correct. That is the typical process. Although, this panel came up with this overarching recommendation table for structuring and analysis. And so there's a component, I think, of the panel's writing that's going to be represented in the introduction that'll need to be crafted as well. So this particular panel's work will have a minor variation on that, but it's typically, that's how it's done. Yes. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, we're going to compile that complete draft, including the introductory material. And you guys are all going to have another public meeting where you're going to be able to evaluate and comment on and adjust that entire draft in toto as a whole complete product. Any questions, Dr. Mel? No.
Oh, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk schedule. So
A quick question.
go ahead.
If there are illustrations, figures that would be useful from EPA, for example, different versions of the maps or something like that, request those through you.
Yeah, if you have data requests or questions for the agency, route those through me. Yeah. And the sooner you do that, the better, because as we get to talk about schedule, it's quite ambitious. Okay, no other questions? Okay, so in part, due to the nature of this material and sort of the agency cycle for being able to ingest it and use it right away, but also in response to several of you who have indicated to me that your ideal time frame for working on this is through the summer, I'm going to suggest the following. Since the report ultimately has to go to the Science Advisory Board, a full chartered board meeting for quality review before it can be transmitted to the agency, that sort of sets a target. And those meetings happen roughly quarterly, not exactly, but roughly. And so tentatively, we're looking right now at possibly having one of those, subject to change, near the end of September, maybe in the last 2 weeks of September. So if we wanted to target our work to mostly be done this summer, we would want to probably present the report at that September meeting of the full chartered board. So the report has to be posted 30 days prior to that meeting for public review and comment, but also we want to give the chartered board members who are conducting the quality review sufficient time to review it and arrive at their thoughts. So that would put us somewhere in mid to late August for posting the report. So to do that posting, I would need concurrence from you all on that draft report, basically in the middle of August. And to do that, we would need to probably discuss the draft by the end of July, which is about 8 weeks after this meeting. So that 8 weeks would allow us to collect the draft responses, compile the draft report, send it out to you, and to hold that public meeting where you guys consider the draft in total, maybe mid-July. So that would require you to start to get me the draft responses by the middle of June, which is only a couple of weeks away. But, I think it's all very fresh in your minds right now. So if you have the time to maybe go and hit the ground running as you leave this meeting, I think this is actually a realistic and doable schedule. And I know several of you have told me that the time you actually have available to work on it is this summer. Once we get into the semester, it becomes a lot harder for you to make the time. So just in summary, so basically the next 2 weeks, you would draft your responses as a team. And then when the lead writer is done, you would send those drafts to me. Dr. Uzo and I would complete the full review draft probably by the end of June and get that back out to you all and post it to the website to hold a public meeting in the middle to the end of July. And then if there's any revisions, we would make those revisions, get your concurrence by the middle of April, I mean, the middle of August. And then we would post the report and initiate the quality review for presentation at a full meeting of the Chartered Science Advisory Board by the end of September. So any questions about that schedule?
Summarize that for us and send it to us.
Yeah, I'll write this up and send
Okay.
it. Yeah,
I
within
was
the
gonna-
next 2 days. Yeah, that's my commitment to you. Even though there's a holiday on Monday, I'll probably get it to you like Tuesday. But that's my commitment to you, is to write this up and get it to you by Tuesday. Very good.
People want to use that table as a basis for some of the sections. There's sort of another step in there where folks would need to look at that and get that pinned down before some of us may be able to really write our sections. So I guess that's a question for the panel to figure out how we work that in, and then also have sections written in a couple of weeks.
So I can email that table out to everybody when I send the schedule on Tuesday. And then if people want to talk about it, it's the same basic rules that we had for private discussions during the breaks. So if you get to like 4 or 5 people, you might want to start getting conscious. But if you're going to like 6, 7, 8 people, we definitely need to stop and have a public conversation. So, private conversation amongst 1 or 2, 3, 4 people is okay. Please include me. Make sure you copy me on those conversations. But if you find yourself wanting to have a conversation bigger than that, you need to pause and contact me, and I'll arrange a public meeting for us to be able to do that.
So if we make that a shared Google document, is that because everyone has access to it? How is that? But we're
So
not
you hit
actually
exactly in the gray area.
We're not,
So
because we wouldn't be exactly communicating with each other. We would just each be having our individual access to the document.
yeah,
edit
so
it.
this is actually a point of debate within the FACA community right now, is like, does that constitute a deliberation to be working on a shared document? We don't know the answer to that, and we haven't gotten a ruling from our legal people yet. So I can't give you the answer to that.
Can I answer it then? I mean, I think that as long as we're not discussing it actively, it seems like each individual can still put their point in. It would almost be like sharing a draft, right? Because we're not going to be actively communicating. It's just but it makes sense. Like, it doesn't make sense for each of us to like add the same point and then realize that we've all added the same point.
So in the absence of a ruling from our legal counsel, that seems like a reasonable interpretation. But if there's like 6 of you editing it at the same time and commenting to each other, then I would urge you to stop and contact me. Yes. So we'll just err on the side of caution with that until we get an official ruling from our legal people.
I will send you an updated version based on today's comments before Tuesday.
Yeah. And just in case the mic didn't pick that up because you didn't turn yours on, Dr. Shaw committed to send me an updated version of the table by Tuesday. Sorry, you have to work through your weekend, but I appreciate that. And I'm sure your fellow panelists do. So are there any other questions about the process or the timing? Are you guys willing to commit to that timing? Because it is an ambitious timeline.
If we're comfortable with our draft, I don't think I'm going to make the last July meeting. If it's towards the end of July, I'm out of town, but I don't see it as a problem if my comments are in the draft and I'm comfortable with them.
Yeah, so I'll work with you directly on that. Yeah, yeah.
That's it, deal.
Yeah, I mean, where are you going? Maybe we'll join you.
Iceland.
All right. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the budget to move the meeting to Iceland, but anyway, I appreciate your letting me know. All right, anything else with respect to the process or the schedule? Okay, nothing heard. So
it's just to clarify, the next one is a teleconference, so it's not a physical meeting.
that is the intention, is a teleconference, not an in-person meeting. And we'll announce that in the Federal Register, and I'll survey everybody for availability before we get there. So we'll do our best. Any other questions or comments? Well, I do really appreciate your willingness to step into this ambitious schedule and commit yourselves to making it happen. And we'll just do our best, and the truth is, if something comes up that absolutely we have to stop and evaluate, and that's going to delay things, then we're going to stop and delay things. But I think at this point, given the deliberations we've had up to now, I think this is realistic and doable. Okay, there were no registered public commenters, and if there's no additional clarifying questions from the agency, which none were heard, I would like to adjourn this meeting and thank you all very much for your participation over these last 2 days. I judge this was incredibly valuable and productive. So thank you.
Thank you.
So
Nice to
we're
meet
officially
everyone.
adjourned.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.
All right, brought it in a little